Okay, with this live stream podcast, we're going to go with the title of a few different topics, and we're going to go over them. And with that, first, I want to ask people to kindly donate to my Patreon. That's patreon.com/challenge history. And before that, uh, before we get to the topic, I'll state that once we reach a threshold of a few people, the people that donate $100 a month, there's going to be a giveaway of a gold Byzantine coin, and that'll be yearly. And the $50 a month, there'll be a giveaway of a Roman silver coin. Uh, and that's once a year. With it, I might make it more frequent as the numbers of people go up. For lower levels of people donating with it, I'll figure out things to give away for those levels, but I haven't figured out quite yet right now. Right now with it, we're looking. First topic is we want to go kind of get a bulk topic with this is on the idea of the Black Lives Matter. Frankly, we've discovered that the whole thing of Black Lives Matter is really just a political movement. It has nothing to do with Black lives. And we can actually tell that because of statements that they've stated that they only want to remove Trump. Now, I personally am not actually voting for Trump when it comes down to the election uh, in November. So you can actually exclude me from that. And so I don't have an opinion for or against Trump, but since they are showing this is only about politics, and it has nothing to do with concerns of Black lives. And let's look at some of the figures on the Black lives that are concerned with interactions with police. Now, when we look at the homicide rate, first of all, the homicide rate actually shows that the actual rate would be at the level of 0.2 per 100,000 people for blacks. Now, this is actually a rate, or sorry, 0.02 actually, sorry for the error. This would actually be a rate that would actually be 1/10 of the rate of the lowest tide countries in the world, which would actually be Singapore and Japan. Singapore and Japan have a rate of 0.2. 0.02 is actually the homicide rate of blacks killed by police, no matter what the case. This is no matter what the case we're talking about. Now, this means that they're armed, they attack the police, whatever the case. This is actually homicide. We're calling all cases in which the police shoot a black offender as homicide, whether it's the wrong person or whether the person was an actual offender, were the actual guilty party, or whether it was out of defense, or whatever the case is, calling it always as a homicide. We're ignoring whatever the outcome it was. We're calling 100% homicide. And we still get that. We're still only getting 0.02 out of 100,000. That's basically nothing. That would be basically, if a country had that would be by far the safest country in the world. And that means what they're actually arguing about is something that is not even remotely close to being dangerous. When they're using the term genocide, there is no genocide from the police. Now, there are 2 points in which they could argue in which would be a genocide. This would be black and black crime from homicide and abortion. These 2 points have actually caused the numbers in the black census to be cut in half since the passage of Roe v. Wade. And you can actually look at the actual census. It was about 26% since the passage of Roe v. Wade. And at current levels, it's just below 13%. That would be an actual thing of worrying about an actual genocide. That means they've actually cut the actual population in half. We're talking basically currently is more black babies are aborted currently than are actually born alive. And it doesn't matter if you're pro-life or pro-choice, you should actually assume that this is actually a dangerous sentiment that's actually basically occurring at this actual time. You should actually realize that that this is a bigger danger. Now, if we look at the actual numbers, you can actually, if you view that as an actual act of homicide, and we can actually see that they actually did charge Kermit Gosnell, one of the actual key figures in getting Roe v. Wade passed. They charged him as a serial killer. We can actually, which is the act of homicide with acts of a point of a certain break point in between each act. We can actually state that that would actually be classified as homicide, and that would mean that we're talking on average, since the passage of Roe v. Wade, of about 1,000 homicides per 100,000 per year. And that, when we look at that, that would actually be a massive concern, because what we're talking about here is something in which no version of democide, basically being killed by one's government in any type of totalitarian government, doesn't matter if we're talking under the National Socialist regime of Hitler or some of the communist regimes under Lenin or Stalin, or under the communist regime of Mao, or under we're talking Castro, or any of these other ones, but we're not talking anywhere close. Even when we're talking Idi Amin and Pol Pot, none of these come anywhere close to that number. And that would be the biggest homicide rate for a group of people. And that would be considered a genocide. Then when we compare that to, let's say, now we really can't compare that in level of black and black crime, because it's not necessarily genocide. It's actually people killing themselves of their own race. And those levels are way off the charts, and that's really kind of another secondary type of way that they're actually assisting it. That's actually bringing the levels down to for whoever gets born, they're actually virtually killing each other. And that's becoming another massive thing, because we're talking, even at current levels, we're talking about 8,000 homicides a year just from black and black crime. And those are just so massive that it can't even be fathomed. And if we're talking if we're talking basically comparing that with like 10 homicides from police, that's not even even comparable. We're talking between 7,000 to 8,000 homicides from black and black crime a year. And we're talking that's between a 700 to 800 to 1 ratio. And that should show you kind of what's happening. And those would be, those would be homicide rates easily within between anywhere between 700 to 800 a year of black and black crime. We're talking on average. So about 750 a year is what we're talking on the average. And that's a massive problem that needs to be dealt with. I mean, obviously, it's not like abortion, which is about 1,000 a year, which is larger, which is about 1 1/3 times that ratio, or to times that amount. But it needs to be looked at. Now, when we start to look at some of the other things, is let's look at some of the ideas of like the tearing down of these statues. Now, when we look at something like the ideas of tearing down the statues, we see that happening with a lot of historic figures. I mean, this has just been insane with it. This is basically, in many cases, just trying to eliminate history because they want to, in many cases, either, and many of these people want to remove history of the certain party that they back. That's why we're seeing removal of specific ones, or they want to remove the founders in which set up the nation as it was originally founded, because they don't like the actual rights that were arranged. That's why they want to tear down all these different founder statues, and they'll use very, very uh, kind of remotely set up kind of almost like standards in which really don't even apply. Like with Thomas Jefferson, they tend to use the idea of, well, he held slaves. Well, the fact is if he would have released those slaves, at what point, what level of freedom would they really have had? Because slavery was still the standard, and they really did not have the ability to actually have the finances to own land. Even if they were to even if they were to have the access to buy land, they did not have the finances to buy that land, even if they had the full rights to buy that land. And that was the whole problem. Even if even if you would have basically granted them the ability to, we're talking that many of these people would have been basically relegated to basically being poor and having to essentially work for someone else at much lower standards. He knew essentially he could protect them from that and give them a much better standard of living by working for him. Essentially, they were not slaves within that standard. They merely were just bound to his property, and that was basically the only level of slavery that they were. They were selling their own goods. They were actually merely the only level that they would owe as a fee or like taxation was basically the maintenance of the actual property. When he went off on his trips, either off to Europe and other countries out into the east, go traveling east, or going out even into the far east into Asia, he would basically he would leave them in control of the property. So it wasn't like that they were basically considered as property of the land. They were merely just citizens there. They were living on the land and working. And this was something. It was the same thing with many of the other founders of the country, and they knew that this was going to be with some of the greatest founding fathers of the country. This is the kind of the standard. Now, there were some of the ideas in the southern states in which they would not have gotten these rights, and this is where the problem existed. And it extended further, and it wasn't until the Civil War. Now, could during in before the Civil War with Lincoln, could he have bought them out of slavery because slavery was in a heavy decline? Yes, he could have with it, but that's kind of that's kind of playing the Monday morning quarterback and looking in hindsight, and where we can't really go back in that time. Now, when we start to look at things, we need to understand that trying to basically destroy the statues and trying to do that with all those things with it. Now we're seeing that they're even wanting to do this all in other countries, but we're even seeing in England the first person in to actually abolish slavery, that they want to destroy that statue. Now that makes absolutely no sense. Um, why would you want to destroy a statue of someone who actually abolished slavery? This is showing that basically that all they're trying to do is just destroy history because it's anything against this actual ideal of uh, potentially that could be harmful to their political ideology, which is Marxism. And this is what's really going into it. And they're even going into these people that are, it's even going almost full circle because they're even in New York, they're saying that they want to take down the statue of Teddy Roosevelt, who was a progressive. I mean, he was the one who started the idea of trying to centralize government. This is the man who basically pushed us to more centralized government, and he is not an American icon by any stretch of the imagination. Anybody considering that is really very mistaken. That's why I disagree with Tucker Carlson on this. He is not an American icon. Anybody who's been told that has been given revisionist history. He is far from that. He did not do anything in the Spanish American War. He would just ride up and basically get nothing but photo ops, and this is all what he was doing. He's basically nothing but a charlatan. He grew up in great wealth, uh, and he was basically would use these different things for photo ops. Now, when we start to look at it, is when we start to see that they're starting to go after him. It shows that basically that they don't even know anything about this, and they're basically trying to go after anyone. And yes, he was a racist, just like Woodrow Wilson was a racist. But the fact is this was their own. This is their own. Basically, these are people that believed in heavy central government, and just like Joseph Stalin and Hitler and Mao and Pol Pot and Idi Amin and all these other ones were heavy racists, and this is the basis of their actual ideology. So if they're trying to get rid of racism, they should be going heavily away from this. I mean, we should actually learn from history when we start to learn that it was actually the racism of Marxism that actually chased these people, that actually chased a lot of these free thinking capitalists away from their actual own country. And they've actually, a lot of the cases, there were book burnings because of these, because of writing capitalist books, uh, such as Ludwig von Mises, and also you had people like Ayn Rand with it. These were people that actually had basically gotten chased out of their own home countries because of Marxism. You had Mises chased out of Germany because of his, or actually Austria, I should say, with his own home country, uh, because of the whole thing of Nazi Germany. Uh, and we also had the thing of Stalin end up in the Soviet Union end up chasing out Ayn Rand, and these were two people that were essentially uh, key free thinkers in the idea of liberty and freedom, and they were pariahs in their own home country because Marxism ruled, and they essentially these were countries that hated Jews. They hated blacks, and they hated any other minority. They hated people that were actually talking about capitalism, and they would execute you if you were actually talking about any of these things, or if you were a member of any of these other groups. And it was about racial superiority. And this is the whole point. This is what Marxism is about. It's about class warfare. It's about race warfare, uh, and it's about it's all derived around hatred, and it's basically and it boils down to all of these different things, and it's never about trying to actually lift people up through one person creating something, employing a bunch of people, and then it creating the opportunity for someone else to exchange goods with one another. Now, it's what people tend to think of capitalism is they tend to think of crony capitalism or fascism. And that's the whole problem. And we have not had, thanks to people like Teddy Roosevelt, who started this garbage, we have not had capitalism in this country for well over 100 years because of the centralization. And basically, what they want to do is they've wanted to slide this thing back to communism, uh, through socialism or communism, because the fact is they think we've had capitalism. We haven't had capitalism in over 100 years, and every time someone brings it up, there's always the excuse of, oh, you just want to toss Granny off the bridge. This is a bunch of garbage, and frankly, we need to end this, and we need to actually go to pure capitalism, because the fact is we haven't done it in a long time. What actually made the United States actually profitable for everyone, and what actually brought up a middle class, what actually brought up the poor from almost nothing, was actually capitalism. Someone that basically made nothing could actually earn something because of capitalism. If you had a product, you could actually invent something, bring it up to market, sell it, and actually you can make a lot of money. You can turn yourself from poor to rich much without much problems. Now, obviously, earlier on with it, there are certain groups with it that had a little bit more difficult time with it. But in nowadays time with it, you could be essentially, if they started to release capitalism, you would have no problem with it. There would be no problem with the race, sexual identity, whatever, because no one really cares. It's just about the fact of the product. I mean, you look at on TV with it, they hawk so much crap, it's not even funny. And we can actually see that this is something that we can actually go toward. And if you're looking now, when people try to say that, oh, that'll be actually bad for the environment, it will not, because we'll have individual property rights. The more individual property rights you have, the better for the environment. Now, this is something else that people need to understand. If you're looking for the safety of the environment, the best way to do it is individual property rights. This means that if you harm someone's property, they can sue you for it. The worst situation you can have is government control of property. How do we know this? Look at some of the worst cases in history of pollution that we've ever seen. The Soviet Union was one of the most polluted places we've ever seen. It's actually since they've turned into Russia that they've started actually cleaning some stuff up. China today is still one of the most polluted places on earth. When we look at India, most of India is socialist. They're one of the dirtiest countries on earth. I'm sorry to tell you this, but that's the truth. When we start to look at all these socialist countries, whenever you find them, they're some of the dirtiest places on earth when it comes to all types of pollution. If you want to clear that up, and if you want to make more efficient sources of energy, more efficient abilities for travel, more efficient ways, more cleaner parks and stuff out there, you need to basically allow for more private property because there's going to be a vested interest in making sure that it's clean as possible. They're not going to have a vested interest in destroying their own property. People who own their own homes are less likely to do this. We even know this in our own country. When we've had public housing gets destroyed very quickly. When we compare that with private housing always gets taken care of. It's a big, huge difference. You can actually see that even in schooling. Public schools more likely to be destroyed because there is no vested interest in upkeep. When you have private schools, they're more likely to have upkeep on them. And this is just natural. And this is what would actually apply in the same way. So if you want the environment to actually be protected, and if you want the actual environment to actually be cherished, that's the way you go, is private property. And it goes the same way with protecting species. You want actually conservation of species with it. The way that this goes is not by price setting. You don't want price setting on certain things like meat and dairy and vegetables and grains. You don't want price fixing. Price fixing means you run out of food. You want to actually have the price fit with the market. If there's more demand and less supply, the price needs to go up. If there's less demand and more supply, the price needs to go down. You can't start price fixing because the fact is what's going to happen is either A, you're going to have excessive supply, which means then you're basically having the government ordered to destroy food, or B, you're going to have excessive demand and low supply, which means you're going to run out of food. And this is inevitably what always happens to socialist and communist countries. This is what you're finding out in Venezuela. People are running out of food and eating their pets. And it's not a problem of mismanaged economies. This is merely the fact that this is always what happens when you price fix. And you're not going to find any other difference when it comes down to it. And this is something that people need to understand. It's just something that always happens. And when we keep doing this, you're always bound to repeat history. And you're going to find the same thing with protectionism. I mean, protectionism is the dumbest idea as well. This is something we're finding with a lot of Trump supporters. Now, Trump supporters are finding that they want protectionism because they think China's doing something with their currency to manipulate the U.S. dollar. It's not them who's actually doing anything. It's actually the U.S. Itself which is doing stuff. What we're doing is we're actually diluting the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar when China is actually not doing anything to dilute their currency. What ends up happening is it naturally deflates the yuan, which is their currency, and it and ours gets a serious inflation, which means theirs gets a huge bump in purchase power. And this is just what ends up happening. And so we end up getting kind of shafted on trade. Now, the only way that where they can actually purchase a lot more things. Now, where they're doing this is they're actually linking their currency to gold. And what our currency is not linked to anything. Our currency is useless paper. And this is what's actually happening. And what people want to do is people want to actually have this idea of closing off a lot of things. They think if you close off immigration, if you close off trade with certain countries. Well, the fact is that's not going to do anything except, or actually also run tariffs on certain countries. All it's going to do is hurt the poor. The best idea to help out poor people is actually realize you need free trade. Free trade's the best idea with it because it brings down the actual prices of goods, meaning poor people can actually afford a lot more goods. And it doesn't matter where they're being made. You need actual competition. If you want to actually start putting the strings to China, you need to start working with many other countries because the fact is you need everybody to compete with everybody else. Now the fact is because we've actually inflated our currency to where since we've actually had a central bank, we've actually lost over 97% of our actual purchase power. This is where we're actually at a huge disadvantage. We need to actually stop inflating our currency. We need to realize that our currency, we can't keep doing this with our currency. We need to actually deflate our currency and stop keep inflating it. Inflation is always bad. And this is the whole problem. It's not, and we find this the same argument with socialists as we do with these protectionists on the Trumpian protectionists. And they keep making the same argument and trying to blame other countries. It's not other countries. It's our own central bank policy of basically being very, very uh, irresponsible with how they're actually handling our monetary policy. Our monetary policy has sucked for well over 100 years. And when we had an actual gold-backed currency, it was a lot better. But being able to print money still allows them to essentially dilute the actual value. And when we went out the Bretton Woods Agreement, which had a set amount of dollars per ounce of gold, this basically allowed them to essentially run roughshod. And now that we're fully off it, we now can basically print whatever we want. And this means we're completely off any type of standard of gold, which means we can basically print whatever the amount that we want to print, and our dollar is completely worthless. And that's what a fiat currency is. You can keep on printing, and you can adjust interest values of how you want to adjust for the to adjust for unemployment and asset values. And that's really what we're doing with the Keynesian model. Now, the Keynesian model is completely flawed. It was based on a person who was a privileged family member economist who had no idea what he was doing out in England. And when we start to look at that, we can actually see that his model was completely flawed. Instead of understanding that the market needs to control the different factors of the things such as asset values, such as money value, such as interest values, when we start realizing that, and when you start using humans to manipulate individual humans at a central bank, you'll realize that it only causes massive problems that only need to be corrected. And when you start stalling the correction, it will only cause massive crashes in the economy that are basically that what they are they're massively delayed corrections that needed to happen long ago. They would have been small but have been delayed for usually decades. And what they usually do, they usually try to reinflate the bubbles. Now, last time with it, we had a housing bubble that they were reinflating. Now our next one that's going to come is actually a bond bubble that's both private and public. Public basically being government, private being from corporations, because that's essentially that's why what we're finding is we're finding that our central bank is buying up debt bonds from private companies to help bring back up the stock market. Now, this is going to cause a lot of malinvestment, and this is one of the major problems we're seeing. And this is where you have a lot of intervention with the central banks. Now, this is where we find a central bank that is the actual problem. Now, instead of looking at the central bank, we find protectionists that go, oh, it must be immigration that's the problem. Immigration is not the problem, because the fact is we can actually solve the issue with eliminating public aid. Because then we'd only bring in people who'd actually be willing to work. And you can easily see that when they would come here. Now, immigrants are not the problem, because as we see with it, we can actually see many times, we can guarantee almost 100% of the time, these immigrants are coming with places with debt to GDP ratios that are far below us with it. In fact, our debt to GDP ratio puts us in, actually, I believe, currently the top 3 in the world, which means we're one of the 3 worst countries in the world for debt. If we're either 3rd or 4th with it. There's us, there's Singapore, there's Japan, and there's Greece. No other country is as bad as those 4. I believe we're worse than Singapore, which would make us in the top 3. The only ones worse are Japan, who we actually copied the idea of quantitative easing from. You have and then you have Greece, who is completely wrecked through a lot of continued bailouts of public unions, and through these bailouts of pension plans on continual basis. They've and being a smaller country, they've excessively wrecked their actual economy. So when we see that they've actually wrecked their actual nation. Now, when we look at the United States, since we're a much larger economy, we can actually see that the damage might not look as bad, but we can see that there really is almost no way to pay back this debt. We've actually, when looking in comparison to the Philippines of their debt, we've actually seen within the last 2 months, we've actually spent 4 times their actual total debt that they actually have. And that's just in 2 months. Now, we should look at that and actually see that that's basically been our problem. We're actually racking up so much debt that it's not even payable. It's not it's not these other things that we don't need to close off the borders. That's actually pointless. We don't need to we just need to get rid of the public aid. That's how you solve it. Number 2 is we need to get rid of we need to view it like we need to start viewing the idea of labor as being able to export it and import it, because we have a lot of needs in this country. We don't need to start actually looking at it in such an idea that we end up actually getting rid of people that are starting to that are basically that we actually need. We need to start looking at, we can trade off certain people that to other countries that they need, and we can actually trade off other people that they might need. And this can be very, very helpful for a lot of different reasons for our country. Now, we need to actually view this in a way of not only trading goods, but also labor. You start trading labor, it's going to be very, very profitable. And really, there's no reason for the government to actually be in the middle of this. Now, the problem being is the government has actually been a weight down on the economy through actually debt that they've produced, through the regulations that they've done, and through what they've done with trying to get in the middle of the decisions of business when it comes down to immigration. Now, there's no reason for them to. If a company needs a type of employee, stop doing it, because there's many hospitals that need actually foreign employees when we don't have them here. And if you look at what we had for the whole thing with the coronavirus, we can actually see that we didn't have to, we could have actually gotten to the point of not actually needing to stall other procedures. We could have actually went right through without needing to stall one actual procedure and not having to say, we're only going to work on the coronavirus. We didn't have to do that one actual time. And because we end up doing that, we end up having to furlough certain workers, because we end up having to do that because certain workers had certain skills. Now, if we would have had enough workers here, we could have actually done it without furloughing actually anybody, because we would have had everything in order that we could have actually done. Now, I know that sounds a little bit confusing with it, but if you have everything in order, you can actually make sure that there's area for the coronavirus, and that making sure that there's also safe area for every other procedure to be done, because you have more than enough people that you can use. This would have been just fine, that we could have actually had done. Now, also, if we didn't have any government intervention in infectious diseases, there would have been no coronavirus to begin with. But that's a completely different topic, because there's actually more than enough ample evidence to actually prove uh, that it was through government intervention that actual stuff spread, and uh, through actual funding created by Dr. Anthony Fauci, who rerouted money through very, very questionable research that should never have existed to begin with. And all the research like that should be pulled, because they shouldn't be making up viruses out of thin air and seeing what happens. This should never exist, because you're trying to play God, where it instead of actually trying to create cures from stuff, you're making stuff up and then seeing what happens with it. And then if anything escapes, you end up seeing what ends up happening. Now, with this whole thing, you end up seeing with what ends up happening with protectionism is you end up basically virtually creating a system in which a country basically gets locked down, and we don't have, and basically you might see some benefits on Wall Street, because you're end up causing local restrictions, because they don't have to have extra expenditures, and they're going to continue to do stock buybacks, and the central banking is going to essentially keep the interest rates low. But if you do any normalization of anything, we're talking that it always causes an economy to crash, because you don't have the actual ability to produce anything, in which we haven't. That's the whole point, is basically you can't bully people to move back with that. Even with cutting regulations, it's only going to do so much if you're not cutting spending. And that's the problem that we've done. We've actually seen that we have not cut spending, we've actually enhanced spending to a massive degree. Even under Obama was spending less, but then he was not exactly Mr. Frugal. And that was the whole point, that he was not exactly one who is cutting spending when it comes down to the economy. And what Trump has done is Trump has extended spending, and he's created a lot of issues in which need to be solved. Uh, and this is something in which have basically created a debt that has actually gone up. We're talking about an average at least so far, of about $1.5 trillion a year. And you can't exactly use the excuse of, oh, but the coronavirus. Well, the fact is since we've actually reduced our spending on actual wars, we can actually, and no additional wars were added, we can't exactly use that as an excuse. Because the fact is when we look at that in comparison with Obama, with it, there should not be uh, any added debt above what Obama had. We should be we should actually be cutting spending. It's there should not have been any additional. When we look at what we had militarily, we should basically be saying, "Hey, we don't need any of this extra garbage." I mean, there was a lot of extra garbage added, and when we start to look at it, we see that uh, there's still a lot of extra cronyism happening with it. If you're looking at trying to go America first, well, going with a company like Ericsson for 5G technology that actually works with the Communist Party of China to get all of their equipment is not exactly the way to go. I'm sorry, but the Communist Party of China is a lot different than Huawei. Huawei is actually completely independent. Huawei's more advanced, and then Ericsson directly works with Xi Jinping. And so there's a lot of differences between the two. So we're talking, that's why protectionism has always been bad for the country. When we've done it, it's always led to a lot of catastrophic problems. And why it's always led to more centralization of power, and it's never been anything good. When we've actually opened up the government, opened up and started to decentralize the government, that's when things have gotten a lot better. And that's why you don't need to be at. That's why the additional idea of adding a new defense department of that space force is the dumbest damn thing in the world. I mean, we're adding other garbage like that, and it just doesn't make any sense. But that was initially an idea proposed by Marco Rubio, and these are the dumbest damn ideas. I mean, this is not freaking Star Wars. And we need to realize that there's so much money wasted that we could basically start shutting down a lot of this stuff with it. We can shut down civilian intelligence, and there's so much of the federal government we can shut down, and it's not even that's not even necessary. We can start basically only focus on defense for the actual United States and its own property, and that would be an America First policy if they're actually looking for America First. But that's not what they seem to be looking at. That's because this protectionism is completely backwards. Because protectionism doesn't seem to be focusing on America First. Because you could be America First with it and have still open trade, and you should be anti-war, doing a lot of negotiations with a lot of other countries for trade. Basically, where you're basically having no interlocking alliances, and basically having a lot of trade deals, and that are basically between the U.S. and only one country at a time, and not interlocking yourself with any one country with any type of defense things with it. No defense deals at all. If they want their own weapons, they can build them themselves. Because the fact is, we don't need blood on our hands from any of that stuff. And that's basically what we're going to wrap up with this video. That's about it. And hopefully I can do another one of these sometime soon. And bye, everyone.